encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. If you want to be a serious Bible student, a successful servant, and a powerful preacher, this is the podcast for you. This episode of Preachers in Training is brought to you by the new homeschool bundles from Sane Publications. Check out new bundles designed specifically for students to learn the Bible from home or in a homeschool setting or for family devotionals. There are 2 bundles for each group, preschool through high school ages. Learn more at sanepublications.com. Hello and welcome to Preachers in Training. My name is Robert Hatfield, and this is the podcast where we talk about all things preaching and ministry. We're glad to have you for Season 12, Episode 7 of the podcast. And today we're discussing yet another listener-requested subject. We love to get these, choosing the better part. We're talking about opportunities, organization, any of the above. How do we choose what's the best thing to do? I think we can all relate to this conundrum, this struggle. Here to help us discuss it is someone I know who can relate to this. Hiram Kemp joins us from Lakeland, Florida, where he serves as the minister for the South Florida Avenue congregation there. Welcome, brother. Glad to have you back today.
Hey, Robert. Glad to be here. Appreciate it.
Hiram's been with us before, and we talked to one of your elders, actually, just last week, Brian Kenyon, newly installed elder, right? That's kind of a new thing.
That's right. Yeah, Brian's been an elder for a few months now. This happened during the COVID thing for sure. It was in the works before then, but recently.
Okay, very cool. Well, we're glad to have you with us today, and we are talking about choosing the better part. Clearly, we have roots here in Luke chapter 10, the end of that text, right? I mean, I'm sure all of us preachers went there immediately thinking about Mary and Martha. Mm-hmm. There is a principle there that is really intriguing. And as I look at that text, sometimes I've struggled to preach or teach it because you don't want to come down too hard on Martha. Jesus seems to be somewhat gentle with her. You know, he calls her by name. He does it twice. But he does clarify that what Mary has chosen to do, choosing to sit at the feet of Jesus and listen to him, over against what Martha is doing, which we assume is generally in the name of hospitality, right? I mean, she's busy trying to be a good host, I would assume, to Jesus. And Jesus makes it clear what Mary has chosen is the best thing to do. I guess fundamentally we need to start in this text a little bit. Any observations you want to make just as we sort of begin to build our discussion for today from Luke chapter 10, 38 through the end of the chapter?
Yeah, I would just say that one thing to keep in mind about this text is that Jesus does praise Mary for choosing to listen to him, and he talks to Martha about Mary choosing the better part. But one important thing is that Mary chose the best thing at that time. There were other times when hospitality would definitely take the forefront. You think about John 13 and washing the disciples' feet. One of them should have already had done that, but they hadn't, and Jesus steps up and shows them an example of servitude. But here, it's about timing, and I think we'll see that as we go on throughout this episode and talk about opportunities and organizing and making choices. There's a time to serve. The Bible talks a great deal about hospitality, but there's also a time to sit and listen at the feet of Jesus. And Mary had chosen the thing at the right time that was most important, and she was praised for that. And Martha, while what she was doing was a good work, and she probably was even overwhelmed and needed the help of her sister for sure, Jesus taught a lesson about structuring priorities, I think, and about knowing what to do in the right time that I think we still need to learn.
I like the way that you described that. And as I said, you don't want to come down too hard because it's a good thing to be hospitable. But at the same time, like you say, this is an issue of timing. As we are sort of lifting this principle and applying it into time management, we could even say opportunity management in ministry and in preaching, there's plenty of work to be done. And often the difficulty is sort of triaging that to help us to know what to do first, what to do now. And then that sort of triage is further filtered by, which is difficult to say, fast. It's further filtered by family obligations that we have, and the need to. I guess if we wanted to, and some of us did this when we were single before we were married, we might just work all the time,
Yeah.
and there's plenty of work to be done. But you can't do that when you've got a wife, when you have children, and even other obligations. So you need to be able to triage this and figure out. I mean, all these things may be good, and that's the assumption of our conversation today. We've got on our table a lot of good things. How do we figure out what it's time to do today versus maybe what needs to be done next, or even tabled till another opportune season? Is that sort of a good way to describe kind of where we're headed today, or what do you want to add to that?
I think so, for sure. And I think another place to consider is Acts chapter 6 with the apostles.
Hmm.
In Acts chapter 6, you have the apostles there, and there's a definite need as widows are being neglected in the daily distribution of the goods there. Benevolence, again, is a good work. But the apostles say that they have a job that only the apostles would be able to carry out, or a job that was their main role at the time, and that was the ministry of the word and prayer. And there would be other times, Acts chapter 3, Peter heals an individual, and other times when they would be about collecting funds to give to saints and others in need. But on that occasion, what was most needful for them, as the church was in its infancy, was to preach and teach the word. And so I think what we need to try to do is try to figure out, there are a lot of good works. There are a lot of things that can be done, but then there are certain things that only we can do and that we're responsible for doing. And we can't leave those things off to try to do 20 other things. And what can we do well? We might be able to do 50 things mediocre, but then maybe we can do 3 or 4 things really well. And then we need to give our attention to those things. So even the apostles carry out this idea of there are certain works that required their attention. They were dedicated to those things, and they left some things for other people to do. I think we do want to do the best we can. We want to take every opportunity, but we also need to remember that God has other servants that, one, need to use their talents, but also can do the work as well. And by maybe delegating or entrusting other people or passing up opportunities for that which is better, we might allow somebody else to serve.
Yeah, those are good points. I love that point that you made about leaving room for somebody else to do something too. And you're right. I think that a lot of the struggle that we're feeling and that this episode sort of comes from is sometimes the lack of direction. Maybe we don't have, a clearly delineated, this is your job description, or maybe hand in hand with this, there is a general assumption, either on the part of maybe elders or the congregation, or maybe even an assumption that I have. I put this on myself to say, well, the preacher or I need to do X, and all of this falls on my shoulders. I think that a lot of us have felt this in light of our present circumstances with COVID,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I need to do a daily devotional of some sort on social media, or it's solely my responsibility to, keep up the Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night content, or whatever. And we have to be realistic with ourselves, like you said, so that we're not spreading ourselves too thin to the point that we're not doing anything well. We're just dabbling in a lot of different things and really not doing really any of them the justice that we ought to do.
Yeah, there's been a lot written about burnout in recent years, and a part of that is just overexertion, being overly committed. And we do need to try to figure out what it is that we do really well, learn ourselves, our talents, our strengths, and then try to work into that mold and better align ourselves with the things that we can do. Paul was an apostle to the Gentiles, and of course, that was Christ's mission for him, but Paul's talents, experiences, and his abilities best suited him. He would preach to Jews, obviously, but it best suited him to be on the road and preaching to those individuals. There were other individuals like Peter and John. They had a different role to play, and Paul he capitalized on the opportunities that were his. And he often would say things like, I don't want to preach Christ where he's already been named. That ground has already been tilled. I'm going to go to another place where I have opportunity to do good. And he was able to just chart those opportunities and make the most of it. We don't have necessarily a job description written out. And so sometimes we might bite off more than we can chew, but we need to like you've mentioned before, try to funnel down what is it that I do really well? What is it that I'm responsible for doing? And also, what is it that if I don't do it, it won't get done? Like
Yeah.
family stuff and our responsibility to our children, because that those things are also the work of the Lord. And we need to remember that, right? Our personal devotional lives, that's the work of the Lord. And like from a preaching standpoint, the local congregation that I serve, that's got to be high up on the priority list. And then other speaking opportunities
Yeah.
and all of those things get funneled in. But first is my relationship to God, my family, the local congregation that I'm privileged to serve. And then now I need to weigh the other outside opportunities that may come. But keeping those things front and center is important.
I've often used that illustration. I think almost everybody's heard it, of the college professor that comes in with a big jar, and then he lays out
Mhm.
all this stuff, and he says, is it possible to fit all this stuff in? And they're like, no, how would you do it? And so some people start, whatever, you've heard of this, and
Yeah.
then he tells them that the key is you got to put the big rocks in first. And so sometimes what I've done when I'm feeling unclear on this is I
Mhm.
have to start, maybe I've got this opportunity that's come up. Hey, would you write this article for X? Would you, come speak here and there or whatever? And I get some of the details, and then we have to say, okay, what are the big rocks? What are the things that I have to do? And that those have to be done even if I add this opportunity
Yeah.
onto that. And to be real with ourselves, to know, okay, yeah, and to include, we're not just talking about quote unquote 9 to 5 rocks. I mean, the sermon is a rock, and you got to, visits are important. That's part of this, sort of these rocks. But you also have to put your family in there, and maybe you even specify out. You got time with your wife, time with your children, other commitments that you have. You got to put those big rocks in first. That's sort of been my approach, sort of the way I've thought of it. And sometimes I'll even literally list them out, or I'll pull up a note on my computer and start listing things. And then over on another column, I might say, okay, well, here are the other opportunities. What do I reasonably have time to do? And I'm finding now it seems that I have less time for those little things than I used to. I don't know what. I hope it's because I'm maturing and I'm trying to do fewer things better.
Mhm.
That I don't know that I should give myself that much credit. I guess I'm curious, a little insight into the way you do that. I mean, do you list things like that, or how do you sort of keep that awareness in front of you so you know what to take on? Or what's harder, at least for many of us, is to what should I say no in when I look at these opportunities.
Yeah, I think what you said is good. And I try to do some of that, write things down, have a schedule of sorts on what
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do and what direction I'm going to go in. As far as priorities, I haven't always done that right, really, about saying yes and saying no, trying to do better going forward, because everybody has the same amount of time in a day and in a week. And if you just keep saying yes to things, eventually your body and your family and other things will let you know that, hey, some things are suffering as you're trying to juggle all of these things. But I do think that it's right that you have to shut it down at some point. You can't work, even though ministry hours are not specified 9 to 5. You just can't work endlessly in all of those day parts. And so, what I've tried to do is have a daily schedule of what I'm going to do as far as speaking opportunities,
Mm.
have a limit of sorts, how many I'm going to do a year, try not to do too many things in the same month. And then when things come up, if somebody says, can you do this? It's either going to be, no, I can't do it. Or what about scheduling this for down the road? Or
Mm.
I can't do this day, but what about this? Or I can't come for this entire time, but could there be a potential weekend thing that we can do, and try to structure some of it to your benefit, but you also can still try and help the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
This is a biblical idea in First Corinthians, and I know they had a preacheritis problem, but at the end of First Corinthians, in chapter 16, Paul tells them some things about his travel plans, and then he says, Apollos isn't coming to you now, but he will come when he has a convenient season. And so that's something to think about.
Mm-hmm. I want to thank you for choosing the better part of this podcast and not that phone just now.
Sorry about that.
I'm just joking. My phone was ringing a moment ago as well. You may have heard it over the podcast. So anyway, yes, we're choosing the better part today. It seems to me that this is as much a mindset thing as it is a scheduling thing. I mean, it's we're not lazy, so we're kind of like trying to walk this tightrope. I don't I don't want to build too much what some people call margin in to the point that I'm just loafing around and I'm just barely getting doing enough to get by. On the other side, I don't want to overexert myself to, and I think that we've already discussed that sufficiently in this episode so far. So I'm trying to view this just the right way. And then too, I'm not just like chasing opportunities just for the sake of for vain reasons, because I'm trying to make a name for myself or I'm trying to build a reputation or whatever. It's more about how can I serve the kingdom. And I love that you brought, Paul up in that and some of these other biblical examples. It speaks to these points that it's about how can I serve. And so I want to serve, and these are great things that I can do, but I have to sort of prioritize correctly first, and then, all right, how can I do this? Can we speak just a minute to the importance of being sure that we're on the same page with our wife? I was going to say wives, with our wife as we're going through this, because it's kind of important that she's good with us taking on what she might perceive to be as kind of extra stuff. So we've got, this is what I have to do in a week per the agreement that I have with my congregation that I serve. And then whatever else I do, I just need to make sure that she's on board with that, because she's sacrificing too, in addition to whatever I'm sacrificing by being away or taking time to write more or whatever I'm doing, podcasting, whatever I'm doing, right?
Yeah, I think one of the helpful things there is to get a different set of eyes on the situation. Yeah. You and I might look at our schedule and say, if I get back here Wednesday, I could be there Friday and come back and preach Sunday. And you might think that you can pull that off. And then your wife's looking at that and saying, no, because I'm going to have to wrestle the kids, or you're going to be doing this, or last time you did that, you were cranky for a week or something like, they
yeah.
look at it from another perspective.
That's true.
We don't want to tell anybody no, but they can come along and help us to be more honest about the circumstances, and also having respect for them and for the family. And everything that we can do doesn't mean we should always do it. And so talking to your wife about these things, making sure they're good with you doing it, keeps your marriage happy, but also you need another set of eyes from the outside looking in that can see the wear and tear on you that you sometimes can't see, or the overcommitments, or the compromises that you're making in many other areas. And so it's good to reach out to them to see what they say and think about it. And it's a helpful thing to consider.
Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of syndication. And by that, I don't mean warmed over outlines and microwaved sermons, where we're trying to fake passion and some of those sorts of things. We actually talked about this very thing on the last episode with Brian Kenyon on keeping your preaching fresh. So, clearly we're not talking about that. But, if my studies for this pursuit, for this opportunity, could also benefit in another area, another opportunity, or could feed content into that, that seems like a no-brainer to me. I mean, it's the same idea of uploading our sermons to YouTube, right? Or maybe even turning them into a podcast or something, because, we do this study. And as preachers, we're not doing all this work so that nobody will hear it. That's sort of my idea. We want to herald this message to as many people as possible. And again, that's not a vain thing. It's not about us. It's about the message. And so it seems to me that as we're choosing things, a component of that, at least in my thinking, is how about the influence? And how many people can I reach? And that's not always a good benchmark. I realize that, because one-to-one ministry can be, in fact, we could argue maybe it is more effective than if it's 1 to 300 or 1 to 1,000 even, or something like that. I mean, investing in someone one-on-one is huge. Mm-hmm. It also occurs to me there's no substitute for one-on-one interaction in evangelism, right? I mean, you can't, any of our online efforts or radio or TV, none of that can replace sitting down with someone, studying the Bible with them, and then helping them to be assisted in baptism when that time comes. So I say all that to say, those things might help us in evaluating what we take on, and even sometimes what we roll off. We may try something and say, you know what, that's not that's not meeting all the goals that I thought it might. I'm not reaching as many people. This doesn't seem to be resonating with as many people as I thought. I might try writing a blog, or I might try doing a podcast, or I might try something like that. Okay, this isn't working. All right, let's back up and find a way to channel this content in a different direction that might resonate better with people. And in so doing, I think that's another benchmark we can use to prioritize in the way that we should.
Yeah, you mentioned staying fresh, but also using what we have already developed. And I think that's a
Yeah.
good point. Like you say, not microwaving sermons and all that, but here's what I mean as far as thinking about opportunities. Suppose someone's written a lot, studied a lot, and taught a lot on marriage, for example. They do marriage seminars, that's their sort of thing. And then they have an opportunity to do a marriage seminar somewhere, and they're kind of questioning whether or not they should do it. They may be more apt to do that than if somebody says, hey, could you come and speak on creation? Now, as a preacher,
Yeah.
it's not that they don't have any material on creation or they've never done anything on that, but the amount of brain power and work it's going to take to get geared up to do that is going to be far more than that which is in their wheelhouse, like we sometimes say.
Mm-hmm.
And so the adage of working smarter, not harder, is true. And smart work is still hard work, but we don't want to overexert if we don't have to. We should be thinking about, what are the things, again, that I'm really good at? What have I put a lot of time into? What do I already have material on that I can go back into, refresh, restudy, and definitely grow from, but also not have to start from scratch in the bottom of the barrel. And also in view of, how much time do I have to work on this? And will I have the time necessary to get this thing done? And then you mentioned like using YouTube and other platforms. How far will this go? How far reaching will it be? And maybe in doing that, YouTube and podcast and blogs, I could kill two birds with one stone, and my material will go out further that way. And I can use that instead of, physically we're limited in where we can be, but with the internet now, there's so many other ways to use our talents and abilities to go and stretch further. So we should think about, what do we already have? What material have we already developed? And how can that be used to further the cause of the kingdom? And what are some things that I just don't do as well that I can do, but it would just take me a lot more time and effort to accomplish? That's not to say you never do those things or try to develop in those areas, but we just need to know and recognize it may be more difficult.
There's a lot of self-awareness involved in this too. I mean, and I
Yeah.
think I've mentioned that once before on this episode, but just knowing how I work, knowing what I've done, knowing what's available to me, I think all that helps. There's one more sort of interesting phrase going back to Luke 10 for a minute. In verse 42, Jesus says that what Mary has done is chosen the good portion, the ESV says, or the better part, which will not be taken away from her. And so if I can just sort of make this principle application, lift it out of the context, and this is really good to do on a preaching show, isn't it? And come over and apply it here. Maybe even the longevity of, sometimes in my thinking, I call it a meaningful impact, a meaningful interaction. That might be better than something that might only last for just a little while. I think that's why it's so important for us to do what you just mentioned, and I mentioned a minute ago, about uploading sermons to the internet for them to live on. Because we all know the shelf life of sermons, so to speak, is very short.
Yeah.
People may still be talking about it on Wednesday night. On exceptional days, when everything clicked just right, people may still talk about your sermon a week or two after the fact. And once in a lifetime of sermons, you might get one that people remember for years to come. But by and large, we've got to realize that, especially when we're doing Sunday morning, Sunday night, Sunday morning Bible class, Wednesday evening Bible class, that's a lot of content. And if somebody's not disciplined in taking notes and reviewing those, that's one of those things that you just might not retain a lot of that. I think increasing the shelf life helps a whole lot, and it may take 5 or 10 or 15 minutes to upload that after the fact, but that may be time well spent when the impact is good and it's sort of evergreen. It remains out there for a while. You got thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think that the ministry that we do and how we can prolong it to, you talk about Abel, he being dead still speaks, his work continued on. And that's what we want our work to do. I've heard that said about writing, that as much as you
Yeah.
can, if possible, you should write things because your writing will last you. We read books and have libraries full of books of men that have long since passed. We may not have their sermons recorded, but we can read and access their writings. And of course,
Hmm.
that's changing now with YouTube and these sorts of things where even sermons are able to be stored. And maybe somebody wants some information that you have on something, and instead of, you may be able to refer them to something that you've written already on the
Right.
subject. You
Yep.
know what I mean? Or say, hey, here's a sermon that I did here, and that sort of deal, instead of reproducing that material. So with the shelf life of our work being able to be increased through the printed page and through the internet and those means, it helps us to do deeper work and do better work instead of always sort of skidding across the surface. Now our
Hmm.
work can last a longer time. And it is what Jesus said about Mary, it won't be taken away from her. She was not wasting her time by sitting there listening to Jesus. It was profitable, and it was going to outlast the hospitality that was done, because as she took in those teachings and put them into practice, she was going to be better for it. And so maybe that's a good question to evaluate decisions that we make. Which one of these is going to have the more lasting impact? And obviously, we don't know all of that for sure, for certain, but based on the knowledge that we have, we can try to determine which one of these is going to have the greater eternal impact,
Hmm.
and how is this going to affect the kingdom? Or even on another level, as far as opportunities and where to go and where to stay, have I done all that I could here? Will going
Yeah.
to this work or taking this thing help me to further my work in the kingdom?
Hmm.
Have I maximized my opportunities in a certain area?
Yeah, that's good. It occurred to me several years ago that I tend to get the same questions
Hmm.
over and over, and I don't mind that. I'm glad about that. But as teenage groups cycle in and out, or even sometimes the same general questions tend to come up. People are thinking about how can I prove that the law of Moses has been fulfilled and taken away, and now we live under the law of Christ. And they may they're trying to think, how can I'm in this conversation with a coworker. I need some good scriptures that I can use to help them understand that, and I don't have that right off the top of my head or whatever. There's a lot of good resources for things like that. In books and things, people have gone in and topically arranged passages of scripture under general topics, and that's really great. But I got to thinking, what would be really a good idea, and I haven't done this yet, is to go in and just write some answers to these and post them on a website or something. And that way we can say, hey, you know what? I've written something about this. Go to this link. I'll
Yeah,
be happy to continue talking with you about this, but this might get you started, kind of thing. And
yeah,
it's not about trying to put somebody off or pass the buck as much as it is, hey, I can get to this quickly. The teenagers used to text me more often than it seems like I'm getting those texts now, and they needed those answers like right then, because they were having cafeteria conversations with somebody, and they really needed to know something. And so, if I could just shoot them something quickly, as opposed to seeing it 3 hours later after I get finished with, a few meetings or something like that, seems like that's a handy thing to do and a good use of the time in that way.
yeah. We do need to redeem the time as much as we
Yeah.
can, and whatever we can do to short circuit that, like you say,
Yep.
that's going to be better for us in the long run.
Well, and we certainly have plenty of tools today to do that maybe weren't even available to preachers just a few decades ago,
Hmm.
in terms of the internet and the speed with which we can retrieve information. So that's a good thing. Um, Maybe let's talk into just for a minute before we conclude. Let's speak to the bigger opportunities that sometimes come along. We may have an opportunity to be a part of something that's going to require a lot of time and investment. Coming up, this is going to be a recurring part of our week if we accept this, or we may have an opportunity to move, and somebody may reach out to us and say, "Hey, we're looking. Are you interested?" Something along those lines. It could be an opportunity to teach in a school of preaching, or something along those lines as well. Uh, do you mind talking with us a little bit about the processes that we could go through to evaluate whether that's the right thing to do? I mean, I know I've just given you a very, very broad question in those different examples, but um, what ought to be some of our thinking about those sorts of things as we're trying to think about choosing the better part? And especially when it seems like there's no wrong answer. We could be
Right.
blessed in this or we could be blessed in that. It could be difficult to discern what would be the better thing to do.
Yeah, I think that some of the principles we've already talked about, some of these, but it's the idea I think of what am I already doing? And if I'm going to be leaving somewhere and doing something different, where can I do the most good, or where do I think I can have the greatest amount of influence? I need to think about that. Have I already maximized my potential in a certain area? But also thinking about the idea that you don't have to say yes right now. Maybe an opportunity comes around and we think, if I don't say yes right now, I'll never get this opportunity again. But that's not necessarily true. God can cause things, if it's meant to be, to come back around again, or even better when seasons of life are better in His providence. But
Mm-hmm.
how's this going to affect my family? How is this going to affect me as an individual? What am I going to have to give up in order to do this? And you talk about those big rocks, and is this a big rock issue? Going to a school of preaching or taking that on in addition to preaching? What's that going to do for my time if I'm already teaching? Just say some people teach at a nursing home, and then Wednesday
Yeah.
night and Sunday morning, and then they also take on the school of preaching and more preparation. What class will I be teaching? How
Mm-hmm.
much prep will I have to do, and that sort of thing. And just realizing that, like you said, if there are two good things, there's nothing wrong with saying no. Doesn't mean I'm turning down the Lord's work or anything like that. It's just this isn't the best thing to do right now. But also not shying away just because it may call for me to step out of the boat and to do something out of the box. Maybe it'll stretch me and challenge me in a way that I haven't. And so I would just say, how does it affect my family? What does it do about influence?
Mm-hmm.
What am I going to have to give up in order to take on this new additional work? And how's this going to impact what I'm already doing? And so
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we look back and maybe you think, oh, I went the wrong way on this. But I think building wisdom from each of those opportunities that come and pass will help us to better serve in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Several things I just want to highlight of what you just said. First of all, that it's worth considering, because you never know when the Lord may be opening a door, right? In Colossians 4, right before Paul says in that context to redeem the time, he does
Mm-hmm.
that in an evangelistic context. And he says just before that, in Colossians 4, verse 2, I think it is, and following, that he's asking them for prayers that the Lord would open a door so that they might be able to continue preaching in different ways. Again, evangelistic context. But Paul believed that God opened doors and made opportunities available. And, who are we to argue with what the Apostle Paul had to say about that? So it's worth considering, number one. And then the second thing that I appreciated what you said was that there is a component of prayer to this, and maybe we haven't explicitly stated this. We were implicitly saying it, and we were assuming that prayer is obviously a part of this, but to trust the Lord's timing in that, and to realize that uh, if this is what His will seems to be, and we're going to try and discern that the very best way that we can. I've often joked, shy of asking for the fleece to be wet today and the ground to be dry, and then vice versa the next day. We don't ask for something that we know He's not going to do, but in terms of in accordance with His will, helping us to have clarity on our thinking, and maybe even in some way an indicator that this is the right direction that we ought to go in. And then trusting that, just not looking back. And maybe we could think, what if, or sometimes we joke in an alternate universe, this might be
Yeah.
what happened. But, at the end of the day, we do what we think is the best thing to do and then go from there. When it's not clear what is the best part out of two really good options, you just have to do the best you can, right? With prayer and wise advisors, and proceed the best way that we can.
Yeah, and I think that's another important thing too, is to have some people that you can bounce things off of. And
Yeah.
I would say both in the older and a younger camp,
Mm-hmm.
but people that have preached a lot longer and been in these sorts of situations before, that maybe have said yes to some things and regretted, or vice versa, bouncing some things off of them. And maybe even if you don't give all the details, say, hey, here are the opportunities I'm presented with. What do you think about my options or choices? And I've
Yeah.
done that, and people have given me good and sound advice. And I think that's a good thing, to be able to bounce things off of others and learn and glean wisdom from people that have been in a similar situation. It might be our first time going through it, but
Mm-hmm.
they can help to make some wise decisions. Iron sharpens iron in that regard, and learning from people that have already walked down that road.
Yeah. And the idea, too, that if I say no, if I pass on this opportunity today, that doesn't mean that I'm never going to have another opportunity in the
Right.
future. And as particularly when an opportunity comes to you, and you were fine before you knew of that opportunity,
Yeah.
and so I like those times when it seems like, well, I'm not really losing anything. I could gain something potentially, but you know what? Maybe now's not the right time. And to have the patience with that, which is something I think a lot of us struggle with, just knowing that, you know what, that there'll be more opportunities, the Lord willing, that will come along, and we'll just keep serving and try and do what we do to the very highest standard that we can do it. And, maybe one who is faithful in little will be given more. And then, to the one who has more and much, even more might be given. Again, as you said, in the Lord's providence and in his blessings in those ways. So I think all these things are things to consider as we're trying to discern whatever the better part is.
Yeah, and I would just say too, one thing to keep in mind, especially when we're doing the Lord's work, is that bigger is not always better
Oh, yeah.
in any way. And I'm not even thinking, I'm just saying in general that we might think that I've got to say yes because this is a bigger opportunity, but
Mm-hmm.
God can make much of our little. And so we might be serving in a certain situation and we don't know what's going to come from that. I think if you were to go back to the first century and say, what congregation do you want to work with, Antioch or Jerusalem, most people would say Jerusalem. That's where all the apostles are. That's where the church began. But the little church in Antioch, Barnabas, and then Paul goes there, and they eventually send Paul out and with Barnabas to do missionary work, and they end up helping. Of course, all of them on the same team. There's one body, but
Yeah.
they end up doing just as much good, and maybe you could say more so in some ways through that mission work. And so Barnabas left Jerusalem and went down to the church at Antioch to take that work. Apostles sent him there. He teamed up with Paul. We just never know what the future may hold. And so that goes back to where one, bigger is not always better, but also we just have to sometimes step out of the boat and trust that God's going to be with us, especially if both options are good and within his will, and he's able to make the best of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, we've been talking today about choosing the better part, and wow, there's a lot to discuss in this. It's admittedly a broad subject, but I think there have been some really neat principles that we've discussed as we've gone through this, and I'm appreciative of you, Hiram, for helping us out with this. I want to mention something else, and some of the projects and things that you have a part of, especially one that's really exciting that's coming out about the same time that this episode is being released. But before that, is there any just sort of concluding words you want to say to sort of wrap up our conversation? Is there anything you're thinking of that, oh, yeah, we should have touched on that, or just maybe a parting challenge for the guys who are listening to this?
Yeah, I would just say that we should make sure to have everything that we do bathe in prayer, and whatever we find ourselves doing for the Lord, do it with all of our might. And when other opportunities, they will come if we do that. If we serve the Lord with what we already have, if we're faithful in what we have, then God will supply us with more opportunities.
I appreciate that. The temptation may be to hold back until we get our big break, whatever that is in our minds, right, in ministry. Well, if I preached for a church of this size, or if I had this many elders, or whatever, then I'd really do my best work. And you're right. There's no reason not to do our best work now.
That's right.
I'm really excited about a new project that's coming out about the time that this episode is being released. A new book. It's there in black and white, scriptural answers to 37 questions that people are asking about racial tension in the church. You're one of 4 authors of this project. Talk to us a little bit about this. I'm excited for it to be released.
Yeah, I'm excited about it too. Worked with Melvin Ote, Ben Gisselbach, and Glenn Colley on this book, and we've seen different things just being discussed in the church, and as things happen in our society, how Christians are sort of struggling with handling these issues. And what we tried to do, all 4 of us have different backgrounds and different perspectives, but we're all Christians and agree that the Bible has the answers to these questions. And so what we've done is try to write this book together as brothers and to unite on the truth of God's word, and believing that if we just come at these issues and questions from the perspective that God is right, God loves all men, and we love one another, we can come to a place of unity in the church on these issues. Not sure about what the world's going to do, but the kingdom of God should be a place of peace and unity on these matters, even if we have different perspectives, and even if we don't agree on all of the finer points of race relations and all of those sorts of things, we can still be the people of God and do his work. And so hoping that this book will do a lot of good and help us have these discussions in a cordial and Christ-like way with each other, and just continue to foster unity. in the church.
That's good stuff. I know it's interesting the timing of the release time, because this is a project that's been in the work now for a couple of years, according to what I've told.
It has been. Yeah, Ben and I had this discussion a few years ago, and then we brought on 2 more with Melvin and Glenn, and I think that was a good idea, and to even do it on the question format. But yeah, we've been working on this on and off for about 2 years, and every time we've kind of got distracted or delayed, more things would happen in the news, and we just get more encouraged that, hey, we need to get this book done. And so I guess the pandemic was the perfect storm, so to speak, to help us have the time to really zero in and get it done.
If people are interested in getting a copy of this, they can get it from any one of you 4 authors. Is that correct?
Yeah, any one of the 4 authors, and by the time of the release of this episode, it should be available in all the major Brotherhood bookstores that someone might try to reach out to.
Great. It's there in black and white, scriptural answers to 37 questions people are asking about racial tension in the church. You want to check that out. Our thanks to Hiram Kemp for being with us today. We want to remind you that we are releasing brand new episodes every Thursday from thelightnetwork.tv. You can also find us wherever you get your podcasts, and Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio. Just search for the Light Network as a whole, or Preachers in Training specifically. You should be able to find us there. Hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed the show so you never miss an episode. And also check us out on YouTube. We're sort of slowly branching into YouTube on the Light Network as a whole, but there are 2 shows right now that are available in video form on a regular basis, and those are Today with Jesus and this one, Preachers in Training. So if you'd prefer to watch as opposed to just listening, check us out on YouTube, search for The Light Network or Preachers in Training, and you should see those episodes there. And by the way, if you hit subscribe on YouTube, we are generally releasing the videos 1 day in advance. So you can get the content a little earlier if that's something you're interested in on YouTube. So the video comes out on Wednesday instead of on Thursday, and that's something that's kind of exciting as well. Next week, the Lord willing, Corey Sawyers joins us to talk about handling stress. Is that something that you've been trying to manage lately? If it is, then I think that'll be an exciting episode and one that can be beneficial to you. Before we go, Hiram, thanks again, man. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert.
And thank all of you for being a part of our episode today. We'll see you next time. Until then, I'm Robert Hatfield. Let's go preach the word.